music.
Attention followers, passengers arriving from Vitoria.
At its peak, Itapemirim had a fleet of 1,700 buses and 20,000 employees serving 70% of Brazilian territory. It was even considered by some as one of the largest road transport companies in the world, with a presence in about 10 Latin American countries as well. The company also introduced onboard service on buses, as well as the use of 3-axle and double-decker vehicles, in several versions which featured a range of luxuries and treats for the passengers. Despite accumulating millions of reais in labor debts and also being sold in 2017 for R$1, the innovative style made Itapemirim a national pride and also the favorite of many people today. It may seem trivial, but it was the first company in Brazil to introduce buses with Wi-Fi, air conditioning, reclining seats, air suspension, and a range of other features. It's almost funny to think that these things didn't exist on a bus before. But how did Itapemirim, being the biggest company in its sector here in Brazil, come to such a bitter end?
And in a financial crisis, Itapemirim had its operations suspended by order of the National Land Transport Agency.
And with billion-dollar debts, the São Paulo Court of Justice ruled this Thursday
the bankruptcy of Grupo Itapemirim, a road and air transport company.
The story of Itapemirim begins with its owner, Camilo Colla. He was a soldier in the Brazilian Expeditionary Force who took part in the campaign in Italy during World War II. During the war, in addition to military rations, the soldiers also received a pack of cigarettes every day. But since Camilo wasn't a smoker, he saw more advantage in reselling his cigarette ration to his fellow soldiers. His small business, during a war, gained traction, and he ended up becoming a sort of supplier. He became so well known for this that if any soldier wanted to smoke more than their daily ration, all they had to do was talk to Camilo. When the war ended, the Brazilian government decided to give a special line of credit to the soldiers as a way to help them reintegrate into society. At the time, this initiative became known as the Soldiers' Line. So, Camilo took the money he had already made from selling cigarettes in Italy and combined it with the loan from the Soldiers' Line. At the time, Ford gave priority to these customers, and so in 1946 he bought a truck.
It seems there was financing, an easy financing option from the federal government for the former soldiers. That happened.
Look, that did exist. The limit wasn't a limit compared to what I myself had available. I managed to make this available with the opportunity I had in Italy itself.
During that time, he focused on working by transporting cargo, but in 1948 he decided to buy a bus to charter passengers. Between the cities of Castelo and, guess what, Cachoeiro do Itapemirim, both in Espírito Santo, the business started to succeed, and by 1950 Camilo already had 10 buses. And then, later, on July 4, 1953, Aviação Itapemirim was founded with 16 buses and about 70 employees. The company always had tremendous drive. Camilo said the roads were in such poor condition that other transport companies wouldn't risk going out. So, Itapemirim would request the routes, and off we went, taking as standard travel equipment a sledgehammer, shovels, hose, tire patching materials, a sickle, and a machete. Because frequently, it was necessary to scrape the mud or clear a path through the brush to get around the swamp. The years went by, the roads improved, and Itapemirim overcame practically all the obstacles. Always bringing a lot of innovation and definitely revolutionizing the way Brazilians traveled by bus. After a trip to the United States in the late 1960s, Camilo noticed that the buses of the iconic Greyhound had 3 axles. He soon wanted to bring this model to Brazil, and then the Tribus was born, the first 3-axle bus to operate here. This product, if we can call it that, was a craze at the time. Thanks to Camilo, this innovation arrived in Brazil in a short time. If you're Brazilian, you know that things usually get here much later, especially in the 1970s. By this point, the group had already bought some competitors and won some bids. The company was already operating in almost all of Brazil, but the cherry on top was still to come. It acquired the rights to operate the Rio-São Paulo route. At this point, that was all that was missing for Itapemirim to become the biggest in Brazil and Latin America. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for the company's golden era to start unfolding, and almost without realizing it, Itapemirim ended up entering what seems to be a dead end: music.
Dad, what is it? A tachograph? It's a device that records the speeds reached, driving times, and the engine's operating regime. When a company goes so far as to install tachographs in its buses, imagine everything else. Travel Rodanave, a bus beyond imagination.
The 1990s were difficult for Itapemirim. There were several factors that contributed to the company's decline. Hyperinflation in the 1990s was one of them, and along with it, fuel prices also rose sharply, which forced the company to operate with fewer passengers and smaller profit margins. Even with the arrival of the Real Plan, which helped put an end to that dark period the country was going through, Itapemirim didn't see things improve. Times were changing, Brazilians already had access to slightly better cars, and many people preferred them over buses. One of the hardest blows the company took during that time was under the Fernando Henrique Cardoso government, which was known for encouraging the civil aviation sector. This ended up leading to the opening of the market to foreign companies, which made the aviation sector increasingly accessible compared to previous decades. Just to give you an idea of the impact, from 2005 to 2013, bus companies lost 7 million users while airlines gained 51 million. Nowadays, it's not very hard to find airline tickets around 300 reais or sometimes even less for the Rio-São Paulo route, so many people chose to fly, which is exactly the route that Itapemirim used to dominate in ground transportation. Despite innovations in its fleet, with buses becoming more and more comfortable and luxurious, Itapemirim simply couldn't keep up with the changes in consumer behavior. The road transportation sector found itself forced to share its space with new market trends. The company tried to ride the wave by launching Itapemirim Cargo, its division focused on air cargo transportation. It even operated 6 Boeing 727 freighters, and incredibly, that number made it the largest cargo fleet in South America. It's not possible to say that the venture was a complete failure, but it definitely drained a lot of Itapemirim's coffers. Eventually, all the aircraft were sold and operations were shut down. Sometime later, driven a lot by his dreams, Camilo still tried to buy Varig before it went bankrupt for good, but the purchase didn't work out. Camilo's various attempts to create a Brazilian FedEx failed one after another. And a little before the turn of the century, Itapemirim began its downsizing process. To pay off its debts, the company had to sell some less profitable routes, and along with that, it also had to sell parts of its bus fleet. To its competitors, Miyun and Águia Branca, the group also liquidated shares it held in Aviação, Cometa, and Transportes Aéreos Meridionais. In addition, it also sold a series of assets, such as land and buildings valued at millions, which were no longer in use. All of this was an attempt to make the company's cash flow healthy once again, out of funds. To renew its fleet, Itapemirim had to resort to a practice called rebodying. It works like this. A bus generally has 2 parts. One is the chassis and the other is the bodywork. The problem is that the cost of getting a new bus is practically split 50-50 between these 2 parts. So, to renew its fleet while paying half the price, Itapemirim decided to take bus chassis that were almost 20 years old and put new bodies on top of them. This served as a kind of cover-up that hid the company's cash flow problems. But then Contran ended up banning this practice, and the workaround that was saving the company came to an end. But things really took a turn for the worse in 2008 with the death of Camilo's wife, Mrs. Ignes Colla. For many, it's no secret that Camilo Colla has been involved in politics since the 1960s. The thing is, to be a politician, he couldn't also be the owner of a company. And that's why he transferred 50% of the Itapemirim group to his wife, which meant that, in theory, Camilo was only a participant in the company. The couple only had 2 adopted children. And Mrs. Ignes Colla's will divided that 50% between them, with 37.5% going to Camilinho and 12.5% to Ana Maria. But the relationship between Ana Maria and her adoptive parents was never very good. Anyone from the city of Cachoeiro do Itapemirim knew that. Besides, the news made this fact very clear. But for some reason, the 12.5% allocated to Ana Maria amounted to only 8 million reais, in the form of an asset, which was a piece of land owned by the group that had this value assigned to it. A nasty legal battle started from that point, where she managed to get the court to freeze assets that would add up to the 12.5% she was entitled to. In addition to accusing Itapemirim of keeping off the books funds, she believed that, through downsizing, the family was kind of trying to undermine her right to the inheritance. But in the end, she didn't want 8 but rather 90 million from the family's estate. At that time, Itapemirim already had debts in the millions. And even though 12.5% doesn't seem like a very significant share of the company, it was enough to suffocate it. Because of that, in 2008, the company had to swallow another bitter pill when it needed to renew its fleet. Since its assets were frozen and the banks didn't care about Itapemirim's situation, it had to keep going along with the downsizing process. It sold 2 of its subsidiaries, Penha and Kiowa, to the Comporte Group, however, with an important detail. The payment was supposed to be made in buses, since at that point, Itapemirim was operating with a fleet that was, on average, 10 years old. Also in 2008, the group had to sell garages and cargo terminals for millions. And even while maintaining a revenue of around 419 million reais, the bills kept piling up. Itapemirim was a giant in decline and nothing could stop its downfall. Over the years, it became a company controlled by an extremely verticalized group. They had a network of hotels, snack bars, gas stations, and even an insurance company. You could say it was a kind of Roman Empire of the roads, which fell precisely because it was too big. So, after years of struggling with downsizing, which was supposed to be temporary, in 2016 Itapemirim filed for bankruptcy protection. The debts to creditors had already surpassed 300 million, with a large part of them coming from labor lawsuits. Besides that, there was a tax debt of around 2 billion in the bankruptcy protection plan. They mentioned that regulatory problems with Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres increased operational costs, and the wear and tear of buses on degraded highways were some of the reasons for frequent losses, which culminated in its decline with a bankruptcy protection process. Amid all this crisis the company was facing, and a guy named Sidney Piva comes into the picture. Sidney Piva bought Itapemirim for the symbolic amount of 1 real while it was going through the bankruptcy protection process. But the deal also absorbed the debts, which in total were already valued at 2.2 billion reais. Despite the controversial management, he remained confident in tackling the company's recovery. Shortly after he took over Itapemirim, the purchase of 400 new buses was announced, an operation that would cost about 200 million reais. This fact, combined with the grand promises made in every interview, left the company's fans hopeful but did not make the creditors happy. All of this was just a flash in the pan, and those 400 units never arrived. Well, so I don't go on too long, let's jump to 2021 with the big comeback of ITA Linhas Aéreas. Under the command of Sidão, the guy had the ability to take over a company that was in the middle of judicial recovery. And in 2021, in the middle of that crisis that suspended flights all over the world, he launched an airline company. With the return of ITA Linhas Aéreas, there was a huge suspicion that the Itapemirim group would not pay its debts. According to Sidney, that was a completely remote possibility.
The creditors won't be harmed when you withdraw this money.
No creditor will be harmed.
But in the end, he didn't pay anyway. Besides, look at what he said in that same interview.
It's worth 4 million.
It's worth it, and I'll launch its initial public offering in 2025. Get ready to buy the shares because it's going to be the best mobility company in Brazil.
When he returned to the company after being temporarily removed, ITA was the first thing he tried to sell. ITA entered the market with a lot of hype. This fact, together with Sidney's promises, made it seem like the company could be making a comeback. But the truth is that this comeback of the Itapemirim Air Division was practically dead on arrival, especially in December 2021 when, out of nowhere, it cancelled 513 flights scheduled for the end of the year. It was right after this event that 99.6% of the creditors voted in an assembly in favor of removing Sidney. The court also froze not only his assets, but those of his wife and other partners of Itapemirim to prevent them from depleting the company's assets. In addition, later on, the court ordered the seizure of some luxury cars to cover part of the debts. In total, ITA Linhas Aéreas operated for 6 months and caused a 42 million loss in a company that was already struggling. The management during Sidney's era, which promised a light at the end of the tunnel, all of this had left Itapemirim completely devastated. In his last days at the company, strange things happened. He opened a company valued at 6 billion in the United Kingdom, and besides that, sold ITA for a symbolic amount of 30 million reais. This company has a share capital of 100,000 reais, and its address is at this place that's showing up on the screen. Even though this story doesn't smell right, I won't go into detail about what the real purpose of these transactions might be. I'll leave a video here in the card that might answer that question, a video where I expose the obscurities of rich and powerful people. The debt of the Itapemirim group totaled more than 2 billion in taxes, and in addition, the company had 1,539 lawsuits which amounted to 110 million. The average monthly revenue of Itapemirim in 2021 was around 15 million. In June 2022, a revenue of 373,000 reais was recorded. Even before the revenue dropped below the millions, things were already bad. I don't know what hope the group saw in aviation, and I also don't know how ANAC was able to authorize its operation, but this situation was unsustainable. On September 21, 2022, the São Paulo court declared the bankruptcy of the Itapemirim group. Because of this, Suzantur decided to make a proposal to lease the bankrupt company's assets. Obviously, the São Paulo court saw that something was better than nothing and accepted the proposal. The customers wouldn't be left without the service that was previously provided by Itapemirim, and the creditors wouldn't be left completely empty-handed either. After all, it would be useless to have dozens of buses sitting idle, especially considering that a large part of the fleet was already run down due to lack of maintenance. That would likely be the fate of the operating units, if not auctioned. From now on, a dispute begins between Suzantur, Viação Garcia, Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres, and the São Paulo court. Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres intervened in the process, claiming that Suzantur could not take over Itapemirim's routes because it didn't have the Termo de Autorização de Regularidade or the LOPE. Viação Garcia was also interested in the bankrupt estate and jumped on Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres' bandwagon. Claiming that Suzantur would not be able to fulfill the agreement, the São Paulo court countered Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres by saying that Suzantur could incorporate the permits that Itapemirim had. In other words, Itapemirim's Termo de Autorização de Regularidade and LOPE would be included together in the leasing package. In addition, the São Paulo court wanted to prohibit Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres from canceling the routes through the agency. This so-called pushback sparked the anger of those guys. They claimed that the São Paulo court was interfering with the judiciary, and they also argued that the routes shouldn't have been transferred to Suzantur through that agreement since they are state property. Additionally, Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres argued that with the bankruptcy of the Itapemirim group, the licenses would automatically be revoked as well, and in this way, there wouldn't be either Termo de Autorização de Regularidade or LOPE to be incorporated into the lease. Garcia jumped on Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres' fight again and accused Suzantur once more of not being capable of operating the bankrupt estate. Suzantur responded to its competitor, saying that if it wanted to, it could even pay off the debt and the creditors in advance. Anyway, this whole situation seemed more like two state agencies trying to see which dog barks the loudest, but in total, there are 4 entities fighting over the carcass of a fallen giant. In the end, Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres allowed Suzantur to operate 4 out of the 73 destinations that belong to the group. Itapemirim, however, forbade the company from using the Itapemirim brand on these routes, under penalty of administrative action. In this decision, Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres also noted that the agreement that handed over the bankrupt estate of Itapemirim to Suzantur does not allow a merger between the two. Therefore, Agência Nacional de Transportes Terrestres emphasized that this can never happen. Currently, if you call Itapemirim's customer service, here's what you'll hear.
Welcome to Suzantur and Itapemirim. For your safety, this call is being recorded. Please hold, we will assist you shortly.
Operations under the management of Suzantur began in 2023 with some routes between São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Paraná. Nowadays, the iconic little yellow buses are ghosts of a glorious and hope-filled past. The Itapemirim logo, which once carried so much national pride, now reminds us of the bitterness of failure and what remains of an empire on wheels. Now it travels down a treacherous and bureaucratic road, heading toward an uncertain future. Hey everyone, this is Marcos, and I have a very important announcement to make. First of all, I hope you really enjoyed this video. By the way, thanks Guilherme for suggesting the topic for this video. Many people ask if there's a way to contribute to the channel. So, for those of you who really enjoy my content and want to support the existence and continuation of the channel, it's very simple. I recently opened up the membership option, and now you have the opportunity to become one. This way, besides financially supporting the production costs, you'll also get some benefits. There are 3 options with very low prices, and you can choose the one that best fits your budget. So that's it. A big hug. I'll see you inside the members area. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.